going to talk about Plantation America. This is a series of books that you have already completed. I think I have here 7 volumes, and you have a few more still on deck. Actually, you've completed more on that, but your editor is just a little bit backlogged. So, so I wanted to have you tell us a little bit about each title and about how you got started on this project. So the first title that you completed, I think, is Stillbirth of a Nation.
Yes, I read Michael Hoffman II's book. They were white and they were slaves in the early 1990s. I reread it about 6 times after that over the course of the next 20 years. Then when I decided to write a series of time travel books set in colonial America, I decided to use some of his material. I started reviewing it. I posted a few articles online, and one of the readers, I think it was anonymous from the Balkans, sent me a link to the Library of Congress file on Peter Williamson's Curious Adventures. It's a story about a 14-year-old boy who was kidnapped, and sold. And after that, he gets bought by a nice man who gives him an education. The man who bought him was an escaped slave, and he actually became his inheritor. This guy basically bought himself a son. And then Peter gets abducted by Delaware Indians, and from there we find out that Plantation America wasn't what we thought it was. So I did footnotes. I rearranged the text, and I footnoted Peter Williamson's Curious Adventures. And I also put in a number of appendices, reviews of other things, and some articles on slavery in general. That was Stillbirth of a Nation. I mistakenly left one segment of Peter Williamson's adventures out of that, and it's in one of the follow-up books. So this has been a learning process for me. So until I'm done the 13th book, I will be correcting them in follow-up volumes as I go. If I find a mistake or if I had a wrong impression, it's corrected by a primary source revelation. I'll fix it in the next volume, and then I'll round all that up and try to arrive at a unified theory in the 13th volume.
Lucky 13th. The next volume is America in Chains.
America in Chains is when I really got involved into looking at runaway servant ads. And I started investigating all the secondary sources that I could. I actually, in American Chains, the core of it is one link at a time, which is a chronology of slavery. So after looking into Peter Williamson's life, I decided to go to the best primary sources extant today, one of which is Hugh Thomas's The Slave Trade. And I looked back into my ancient research, and I tried to do a comprehensive chronology of Caucasian slavery from the Middle Ages up until, I think, 1929. The rest of the book is predominantly answering questions that readers sent me about different aspects of slavery. Older articles I had written about ancient slavery and different forms of slavery, and the beginning of covering some runaway ads. It's probably the most general history of the whole set, American Chains.
The runaway ads is probably where I started reading contemporaneously as you were putting it up on your website. And I think it gives a very interesting picture of just like the everyday classified ads were dominated by these runaways. And they weren't black slaves, as we have been led to believe. They were servants and slaves and white people who were to be caught and ransomed or redeemed and serve their sentences.
And some of them are runaway apprentice ads. And we thought apprenticeship was a great thing, but apparently not for a lot of people. The interesting aspect of the runaway ads is you could see an evolution in the disintegration of the plantation system, where you have values of certain types of runaways plummeting, and then you see an alliance of runaways, where you'll see a highly educated man who was sold as a teacher making an alliance with maybe a guy that was a ditcher, and they would team up with the educated man forging freedom papers and posing as the owner of the other man. And you got this crossover with a lot of runaway Irishmen teaming up with runaway black men, and they would pose as owner and property as a way to get out of that. And so it's really fascinating. It's something that you want to explore chronologically when you look at the runaway ads.
They do. They come into play later in this series as well. So tell us about Into Wicked Company.
Okay, this is the shortest book by far, and it's I got a hold of the whole copy of James Revel's poetic account of his enslavement in America. He was a bad boy. He ran with a gang of kids. The older gang members were hung, and he was sold because he had parents in good standing. And he made actually, it was a pleasing poem to read that was sold in England as an admonishment to young boys to not be like James Revel and not get sold into the plantations, because it's a miserable life. So you should listen to your parents, and you should not steal. So he was a convict laborer. So James Revel did 14 years. The other aspects of it, one of them was a letter home from a girl named Mary Sprigg, who was apparently sold by her father because in some way she disobeyed her father. And she was in the process of being beaten and worked to death when she wrote this letter home to her father. So there's a few other garnishes in there, but Into Wicked Company might be the easiest first volume for somebody to pick up, because you can sit down and read it in a couple of hours, and it gives you a snapshot of a few different things.
Next we have A Bright Shining Lie at Dusk.
Okay, this was an attempt to tie the previous books together. I wanted it to be a capstone for this whole thing. I wanted to wrap it up right there with the fourth volume. At this point, I was pretty much sick of it. And I said, this is ridiculous. Nobody wants to read it. It's depressing to look into. So I'm going to wrap it up here. And in the process of doing that, I found so many primary document threads that it propelled me to expand the outline of the series. There are a lot of reviews of articles and different books in this, more answering of questions that I found in my research, and you start to get more runaway ads. And A Bright Shining Light at Dusk, you have a lot of runaway ads because this is starting to dominate my research at this point. Thanks largely to people doing genealogical studies, trying to find out who their ancestors were, and a lady that writes about how to make authentic period clothing. She uses the descriptions of the clothing worn by the runaways and stolen by the runaways, because anything that they wore to protect themselves against the elements would be stolen, because they would arrive with a single hat, usually no shoes, a pair of slacks, and a shirt. And to run away successfully in what was the Little Ice Age in northern North America was a really harrowing prospect, and they needed to clothe themselves up. So you might get a full clothing inventory from one of these ads. For instance, the women would notoriously steal like 3 changes of clothing. And so this was a really rich source of tailoring advice for the people that are doing clothing for authentic reenactments for periods around the Revolutionary and French and Indian War.
I didn't realize that aspect of it as I have been reading it. The next 2 volumes are so his master may have him again, and so her master may have her again. I think you split these up.
Yes. There's the ads take a very specific form. About a third of the wordage is repeated in every ad. And those 2 things, so his master or her master may have him or her again, that's common. And the other thing is a structure where the date and the amount of the reward being offered is, what they were wearing, what they looked like. These are all structured in the same manner. They're following a very strict form here. And these are studies of runaways. The first one is Half of it is a study of the runaway women, all the ads for runaway women I could find, and there's not that many of them. I think it's less than 5% of the runaways are women. The other thing is you only heard about most of these runaway Caucasians from the point of view of their owners. Peter Williamson got lucky. He distinguished himself in combat, so he had sponsors that would help him get a book published. But the people who left a lot of nuts and bolts information behind as to how it was that somebody ran away and how you actually did it would be the later black runaways who would find sponsorship amongst highly educated northern elites who were abolitionists. And very often, now, Frederick Douglass had these poor white kids in Fells Point, Maryland. They helped him learn how to read and write. But for the most part, most of these guys learn how to read and write from the abolitionists that would adopt them in the North and be their sponsor. Then they would help them write their book, and then they would help them get it published. So I found a text. It was written by a guy named Kraft. I think her name was Mary Kraft. I forget what his name was. He wrote the book, and it was about him and his wife running away. His wife was just plain old passed for a white woman. Anybody that saw her thought she was a white woman, which, you know what that means? She's probably got over 90% Caucasian DNA. And she was a slave deep in the South. And they got married. She was an octoroon or a quadroon. William Kraft, I think was his name.
I think it was Ellen and William
Okay.
Kraft.
William Kraft looked like a mulatto. He looked like, a mixed race guy, a guy that would be like a rapper today. So he posed as her servant, and this wouldn't fly if she was a female. So they dressed her up like a man and pretended that she was suffering from psoriasis or something and put some makeup on her. And they made their way north that way. So there was a lot of information in there that would illuminate the plight of a woman that was running away during these times. So that is 1/3 of the book is actually the story of this man and his wife running away. And the wife is predominantly Caucasian by ancestry. So I thought it belonged for that reason, but it crosses a lot of lines, the book does. And it helps illuminate what might have been waiting for these ladies that were trying to run away in an earlier period. It was bad enough for Mrs. Kraft.
It was probably unusual enough for a woman to be traveling solo anyway, or even with just a servant. So
the one about the men, so his master may have him again. It's just a litany of brutality. Okay. Plantation America was primarily about abducting, beating, and working young boys and young men to death. That's what it was about. And that's what that book is about. Lots of names. We'll try to get the personality of these people.
yeah, so the last volume that's currently available is The Lies That Bind Us.
I tried to get at the root of our collective amnesia as a nation that supposedly no people of European ancestry were ever held as slaves on this continent, which was basically deforested. This was the biggest forest in the world, and it was deforested outside of the Amazon basin. And it was deforested by a bunch of predominantly teenage European slaves. And it took them about 200 years to take down as many trees as the Industrial Revolution has still failed to cut down in the Amazon. Okay, so it gives you an idea of the scale of this undertaking. The core of this was an examination of the founding documents, which was really preliminary. Okay, I touched on this again later. But most importantly, a look at the Magna Carta, the poor laws that came out of Britain and were applied, like the Vagabond Act, in Plantation America. So this is really a look at the whole system of slavery that came out of Great Britain, how it's veiled today. So this actually, once I did this, it demanded that I do the rest of the books in the series. Information started coming to me from readers, lots of primary source information, stuff that I didn't even imagine existed, and I just had to cover it. So those first 7 volumes, that's basically my initial look at this. And then at that point, with that much of a handle on it, the rest of the series is tackling the rest.
Yeah, so I'll give the tentative titles of the rest of the series. It's The Greatest Lie Ever Sold.
The Greatest Lie Ever Sold is a in-depth look at the actual laws and practices that govern Plantation America. Okay, so we go from what you had in England as it was applied here, and then how it morphed when it got over here. And again, The Greatest Lie Ever Sold has got a ton of runaway ads, and it's a continuation of the series. It's probably the best general history of the subject that I've done thus far. It's completed. It's in my editor's hands.
Yes. Next is Cracker Boy, which is also in your editor's hands.
Cracker Boy was begun almost a full year before I began The Greatest Lie Ever Sold. The Greatest Lie Ever Sold was an attempt to split Cracker Boy in half so we could get it into 2 volumes. And then the avalanche of primary sources started coming towards me. I had Gottlieb Mittelberger's History of German Enslavement in America, which is something that was downplayed even by my best sources. I used a lot of state and county archives predominantly from Maryland that dealt with how people were released, people of different races, how they were treated, how they were released. There's an archive I found in Maryland that lists every runaway in Maryland from 1729 to 1776, when magically it appears that people no longer ran away, but that's not the truth. It was actually, I found out that there was an avalanche of runaways in 75 and 76 as we went nearer to Revolution. Cracker Boy is a huge book, and Lynn's going to do some statistical breakdowns of the list of runaways I had, which I think is 938 people, and something like 60 of them are women. Okay. The other thing that's part of this book is Thomas Jay's biography and posthumous debate with Benjamin Franklin, who was probably our most prominent white slave, and he was a runaway. And he also later printed ads for the recovery of runaways, which was quite interesting. Okay, so Cracker Boy is a huge book, and it's on Lynn's desk.
Yes, it is. The next book will be American Spartacus.
American Spartacus is 2/3 done. I am using the Samuel Wiseman's Book of Record as my primary source for this. 1/3 of the book focuses on the history of slavery in the earliest periods in America. Another 1/3 of it focuses on the history of revolution in Virginia in the 1600s and 1700s. And that's going to focus on Bacon's Rebellion. The other 1/3 of the book is a complete history of slave rebellions from 1585 until 1860, which it's already 90 pages. Okay, so this is, I believe I'll be able to get this in just under 500 pages. And I only need to have a few books with me to finish it. And I'm going to take those books with me when I'm living in the dressing room of Manny Soprano's strip club in New Jersey. And I will dutifully finish American Spartacus under those trying conditions.
Very good. Manny's a great host. I know that.
Yes, I think so. My fighters are very impressed with his hospitality.
The next one you have listed here is the 13th Tribe.
Okay, the 13th Tribe has been in progress before the last 3 books I just discussed. And I'm using as a primary source Thomas White's The Planter Plea from 1630. Okay, this is where this guy lays out how you run a plantation. This is set in Massachusetts. This is primarily a book on slavery in New England. I'm also using The Wonders of the Invisible World, which I've already annotated, by Cotton and Increase Mathers and 2 other gentlemen. And there is, in this, going to be an extensive history of the slavery of English colonists by French and Indians, which is a very big part of the history of Plantation America, which is the buying and selling of English people by French people and of English people by Native Americans. And the concept is that the core book in this is going to be Increase Mather's Indian Wars, which is one of the biggest slave rebellions there was, and it happened at the very same time that Bacon's Rebellion happened in Virginia. And at this point, a number of the surviving American Indian tribes were actually enslaved. Okay, they were subject peoples. So it's partially a story of the Revolution. So this is something that's been very much misread by all the historians that have looked into it. And I'm taking the most time with my analysis of this situation because it's what's going to put me in the crosshairs of, academics.
It reminds me of the fact that this is a really varied practice in history. It varied from one colony to the next, and it varied across time in huge ways, right?
Yes. Each book, I've taken a chronological approach with each book, and the second half of the series is primarily an attempt to isolate different areas in Plantation America and see how it went there. Because even the few other people who have researched this have had a problem with conflating things. A lot of the problem that Hoffman had with conflating these issues was he was publishing in an era when you had to do these tiny print books if you did anything that was not politically correct. So he had to compress his information so much that you got this conflation of the subject matter. Okay, so I'm hoping that this is probably going to be the most isolated study. It's going to be the 13th tribe. It's going to cover the smallest area and maybe give the most in-depth treatment of the subject in that area.
Okay. Paleface is next to last.
This is an outgrowth of this whole thing. Where did these runaways go? They went two places, if they got away. And this was mentioned by the people in their ads. In the earlier times, these guys were usually, and it depends on where you are. Early times in Pennsylvania, they're going to New York or Philadelphia or Baltimore to try to get on a ship because they'd rather be a pirate or they'd rather be abused by the British Navy than to work on a plantation or in a workhouse. Then as the years go on and the Indian Wars heat up and the tribes begin to fragment, you see all these runaways are now just going out into the woods. And at the same time, you're seeing artwork appear in the 1700s of very Caucasian-looking Indians. And you have records of the chiefs of these tribes are very often the sons of British governors and English governors who took an Indian wife as an alliance with a chief. And then the guys low down in the ranks in the tribe are runaway Irish guys. It's almost like you had an Indian Britannia right out there in the mountains. So this is such a huge project. I could probably do nothing but paleface for the next 4 years and make like this 1,200-page tome of all these white Indians, and then everybody would hate it. Okay. I'm going to limit myself to just doing this one 700-page book of all these white Indians that people thought were Redskins. And they look like their daddy. And who was their daddy? He was an Englishman.
Right, or a Dutchman, or yeah.
Right. So we're going to have, my favorite one is a guy named Brule. Brule was a bearded white Indian. He was a runaway Frenchman. He was a French convict that got sold to Champlain, and Champlain gave him the job of making alliances for furs with all the Indians, and he saw it as his business to keep the Jesuits out of the Indian business, because as soon as he converted these Indians to Christianity, they stopped killing animals and selling them to his master, Champlain. And Brule also found out that sexual hospitality was a large part of Algonquin Indian life. So if you were a high-status male from an allied tribe, and it was your job to go from tribe to tribe and have powwows with the chiefs, then the chief's daughters were in charge of entertaining you. These would not be married women. They would be married later after they practiced on you. Okay? So God knows how many sons and daughters of Brule were spread all across the Northwest. There's a letter from these Jesuits complaining about this guy being much addicted to wantonness with women. I mean, this is all this guy did was it was like one orgy after another when he went to all these Indian tribes because he was a high-status dude. Brule's an example where you probably got a lot of white Indians, and this was in the 1600s. This guy was doing this like in 1614.
Okay, so there's a couple points to make there. This was a long time ago, right? So a big part of the genetic lottery is who gets there first. So that's, going on 500 years or there. The other thing is that a lot of people, this is something that's been borne out in modern genetic testing, is a lot of people who believe that they carry Native American blood do their 23andMe and find out that they don't have any. So my interpretation of that is that the family lore tells you you're Indian, but your Indian ancestor was a white guy.
Yeah. Nick Mason from the Myth of the 20th Century said, this is the one that's going to get me hung. When I come out with
Yeah,
Paleface.
it is. Yeah.
But really, I mean, this is all these poor people that find out that they have no Native American DNA or Amerindian DNA. I'm just doing this to liberate those poor folks because Daddy might have been an Irishman, okay, but he was out there scalping white men.
That's right. That's what counts.
That's what you're killing white people and you're trying to erase that white privilege, okay? And these guys were even painting themselves so that people wouldn't know they were white. There's this guy named Sandys whose brother was the governor briefly of Jamestown in Virginia. He's in camp talking to Powhatan after he's old, and he's all upset because Pocahontas went to England and died of diphtheria or whatever happened to her. Powhatan had a beard, by the way, and his beautiful daughter, looked like she came right off an Italian photo shoot in Sicily for some fashion magazine. Okay, so they were already mixed at this point. This Indian comes up to him, and he doesn't recognize him, and he starts talking to him in perfect English, and he realizes that this is a guy that ran away from him, that ran away from Jamestown like 10 years ago, and they were actually looking for them. They wanted to execute all these guys that ran away, and they would get off the ship from England. These people had never been in Virginia. They would immediately look at what a shithole Jamestown was. You got guys dying of starvation, guys locked in stocks, guys getting beat up, and even the guys in charge look like hell. Okay,
yeah.
So a third of these people immediately ran for the hills. This was like standard. They'd never been in America, but they knew that the Indians lived better in America than the English did. And they immediately wanted to go there and live with them. Okay, so I don't see this as an indictment of Native Americans. I see it as an indictment of European civilization by European civilians who immediately want to be Indians as soon as they get to America.
All right. Right.
Okay.
And it's still true, right? Because people love to claim Indian ancestry. There's something about it, there's something so appealing about the happy hunting ground and it's a different life.
Right. I actually have a shirt that Riley gave me that was made by this Indian on a reservation in Wyoming, and it says, "I'm half white, I just can't prove it." And it's got this face that's like, bisect, and it's white on one side, it's red on the other side. It's kind of funny.
The last item on your list is The Secret History of Plantation America. We don't call it colonial America or pre-revolutionary America, I guess you could call it too, but we call it Plantation America, right?
Right, only because that's predominantly what people called it. Now, if you're looking at historical records from the British state, okay, you would have the word of plantations and colonies. When you look at the official history of it, half of it they say colonies, the other half of the time they say plantations. Sometimes they say both in the same section. It would be the plantation of Virginia, His Majesty's colony in America, So at some point, American history historians just picked one. They said, well, we'll use colonies instead of plantations, probably because it sounds less indicting of American history. But I'm interested in the history of the people that actually lived here, not the guys with the wigs sitting in Parliament in London. And what did everybody that was sold here call it? They called it the plantations. And even the people that weren't sold here, anybody on the lower end of the social scale, which was most people, they called it the plantations until it became the United States of America. And what I'm putting in this book, I have a number of things that are radioactive, like things we wouldn't talk about on here, the myth of the 20th century, because it would immediately get its banned. Any of that kind of information is going in the last book in the series. And I'm not even putting it up on the Patreon site. But primarily what this is going to be an analysis of all the information in the previous books. Okay, I won't start into that portion of this book until all the other ones are done. So I have them here to line up. And it will also include some things that I haven't even seen yet that I don't even know exist. And I'm going to stop writing the history books at that point, because at that point it's going to be almost 2020. And whether the God Emperor wins or loses, I'm predicting that censorship is going to become huge, and writing any more of these history books would get me in trouble. So I will continue writing the Plantation America fiction, which is ongoing in the novel Sold, which is adapted from the confession of Thomas Hellier, who killed his masters, a white man who killed his white masters in Plantation, Virginia in 1678 near a plantation called Hard Labor. He spilled his guts the night before he was executed. He even gave a speech on the gallows and admitted the more terrible things that he had done. Okay? He's not a sympathetic character, so in order to make it a readable novel where you're not hoping that the protagonist is going to die in the next chapter, I put two other characters that are based on historical characters but are not historical characters. A child and a lower class man that suffers an injury and can't do his job anymore. So there'll be two fictional characters that will go along in a novel along with Thomas Hellier, who is the subject of it, but he wasn't a good dude. I mean, in a way he's kind of a hero because he killed his masters, but he was also a slave master at a certain point too, and he wasn't a good dude then either. So, and the fiction in Plantation America, I have 2,000 characters, roughly speaking. There's so many characters, these runaways. I want to write short stories and novelettes and novellas about these runaways. There's this one chick who was a runaway barmaid, and apparently she was fat and she wasn't very good looking, and she had outsized breasts, which big breasts were not considered attractive. They were considered hideous in this age. And it gives you an idea how screwed up these people were, okay? So how far we fell from the
Sounds like
mess.
she was made for Big Ron.
Right, yeah, big Ron would have loved this chick. Well, anyhow, she runs away from the bar owner. The bar owner's an aspiring poet, so he actually spends like 4 times as much money, or no, it would have been 8 times as much money based on the column length that he used. He composed a poem making fun of her as her ad for running away. He punished this bitch before he even caught her. Okay, so these characters that run away, I would like to try to take an educated guess at maybe where their life might have taken them, and do a bunch of short stories and different types of fiction in the future, and leave the rest of the history for some other amateur historian who doesn't want to be respected by anybody in academia to do the rest.
I prefer rogue historian.
Okay, thank you. I think 13 history books is enough. I'm on average 450 pages.
It's a lot.
Yeah, so it's kind of ridiculous. It's mind-boggling. It's largely turned my brain to mush, and it will qualify me for writing a lot of fiction on the subject.
Thanks, James. I think you have done a really good job of explaining the existing Plantation America books and where you see it going. Everybody knows to take your predictions with a grain of salt. I wouldn't be surprised if you have twice as many books left in you as you think, but we'll see.
Thank you, Ann.